will get underway. Thank you, everyone, for joining. We are excited today because we are debuting a new capability at Redica Systems, Postmarket Intelligence, and it is the first product that we have custom built for the MedTech side of life sciences first. In time, we'll extend this over to Pharma. But for now, it is a MedTech specialty. And so that's exciting. We are, just to refresh everyone on Redica Systems, we are a data and analytics platform dedicated to helping life sciences companies reduce compliance risk. And so today we will show you not only how to meaningfully reduce compliance risk and save yourself and your team a lot of time in so doing, but we will also be debuting a brand new capability in Postmarket Intelligence. So exciting day. And with that, I'm going to briefly introduce our two hosts, Allison Sathi and Ryan Donahue. Ryan, take it away.
Yeah, thanks a lot, John. Appreciate it. So just everybody, my name is Ryan Donahue. I'm the VP of Sales over here at Redica. And I'm really, really excited about today's webinar because, again, as John mentioned, we're releasing a new product here at Redica that right now in its current state is entirely focused on MedTech and MedTech post-market quality data. So Allison Sathi is our SVP of MedTech. Allison brings a wealth of knowledge to Redica, has been working on this product for years, even probably before coming to Redica. I'm sure she'll tell you that. But one of the big things that we kept getting asked by our customers is, hey, there's all this post-market surveillance work that we need to perform and be on top of. And again, it sits around a lot of disparate data sources. So there's recall data, there's adverse event data, right? Vigilance reports, trends, benchmarking. So can you help us with, number one, compiling the data, getting the data, making sure we're not missing any of the data. And then number two, can you help us make sense of it, right? And that's our job. That's what we do. We go get data out of deep, dark places, and we provide insights based on that data. And that's through our beautiful analysis and whatnot. So I don't want to spoil too much. I'm going to pass it over to Allison and let Allison take it away from here, but I will be jumping in and asking some questions. But one of the things I think that's really important is we're going to start talking about like what is currently available in the market today and how do you compile this data? What are the challenges that our customers are running up against from we've understood them to be? And then Redica's product around MedTech post-market quality data. So Allison, I'll let you take it from here.
Awesome. Great. Yeah, so good to be here. Thank you all for joining. And like Ryan said, we're really excited to introduce this product to you because it's really Redica's first foray into kind of the product-centered data space. And what we're going to focus on today is really how to make the most of your post-market intelligence, right? So we're going to share some of the things that we do, some of the challenges with data today, but we're really going to talk through that whole post-market surveillance system as well. So let's just jump right in. As I said, we're going to go through some compliance and use cases. We're going to talk through the data landscape today and how that works, as well as Redica's approach and kind of what we have made in terms of this first post-market data product. So let's start out with some of the use cases and compliance requirements. So of course, everybody knows we have to do our post-market surveillance for compliance, right? We've got to meet the regulatory requirements. There are regulatory records that we have to file like PSUR, CERs, post-market reporting in general. So we all know we have to do that, right? But also when we're talking about making this data work for you, making your post-market surveillance work for you, this data and the analytics and the records that you're generating really should be doing other things as well, right? So what we want to turn to is kind of monitoring your device safety and performance, right? We all want more safety, more efficacious products. We want to head off any risks. And so really putting this data to work for you to do those kinds of things. And then, of course, there's the whole life cycle management piece, right? So that's the TPLC. And really this data should be fed into your entire total product life cycle. So we'll get into a little bit of that in more detail.
So Allison, okay, so regulatory requirements, like that first one is a big one. I know there are many.
Yeah.
Can we tackle that first? Because
Yeah.
I honestly, I think that's a good starting point for us here to understand what are we up against.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the baseline, right? You have to be compliant. You want to make sure that you're fulfilling all of your compliance obligations. And the post-market surveillance kind of requirements show up in a couple of different places, right? And we just kind of have the US FDA and the EU up here, but every regulatory agency, right, across the board, we're looking at having to do post-market surveillance, looking at having to kind of monitor your products for their safety and effectiveness. There's different vigilance reporting requirements, recall requirements, in all of these different jurisdictions. So here's just a couple. And so those regulatory requirements, obviously, you've got to perform post-market surveillance, right? You have to feed a lot of different data sources into those regulatory records. But I think it's worth also looking, and again, when we talk about making that data work for you, looking at the standards, right? So obviously you've got 1345, that's your QMS, right? Post-market surveillance is a huge part of kind of the life cycle and the records that you're generating for that. 20416 is actually one of my favorites when we're looking at post-market surveillance, because that technical report is specific to post-market and gives lots of concrete examples for, what should be included, how to conduct, how to structure some of these reports. And that's this image on the side that I like so well, right? Which talks about kind of where are these post-market records hitting, what should they be feeding, that kind of good stuff. But then there's some things that we don't naturally think of too, right? So when we think of things like, obviously, risk management, there's 14971. You need to be feeding, identifying harms and hazards, and post-market is a great place for that, right? Especially if you're developing a new product, as well as clinical trials, and even things like usability, right? Identifying risks, identifying potential risks, and actually based on real world data, right? What's actually happening out there in the marketplace, being able to get that data is really, really important.
So Allison, real quick, besides the obvious, right? We all have to be compliant. We have to stay up to date on the rules, regs, guidance, guidelines, standards, etc., ISO, whatnot. What else do the regs and guidances help us do? Or maybe the better question might be, are there any missing details that we need to think about? Like, obviously the devil is in the details, and the regulations are fairly broad, as we all know. So like, what are some of those, the missing things?
It's a great question. It's a great question, right? Because it's incumbent upon the manufacturer, the license holder, to actually perform this post-market surveillance in the way that is most effective for their products, for their types of products. So we do get kind of the guidelines around what that post-market surveillance should entail. But as we know, the implementation varies a lot from company to company. And in this vein of kind of making that data work for you, here's just a couple of areas, right? Of where in the QMS and the RIM system should this data be kind of finding its way, right? Where should these records be generated? And so we're probably all most comfortable with this third piece, which is regulatory submissions. And of course, we're thinking our post-market submissions, right? Our CERs, our PSURs, our risk management file updates, right? Those regulatory submissions that go actually into the records that go to your regulatory agency. But as we said before, there's lots of different areas where this data is incredibly useful and helps us reduce risk if we can use it effectively. And that's a big if, right? Because there's a lot of things that we'll get into. Some of these challenges, especially historically, where we haven't had this data readily available. And I'll just touch on a few of these, right? Because a lot of people, when they think about compliance, they're really thinking about this third vertical, and they're not necessarily kind of expanding out to say, hey, what can this data do for me, for my products, for my organization as a whole? So if we started with kind of like the quality risk space, those are things like management review, management reporting, and those are looking at things like quality metrics. We think of ISO 13485 with measuring and monitoring, looking at quality metrics across the board and being able to compare your organization, your site, your product to other organizations, sites, and products in a similar space, right? We can look at recalls, we can look at adverse events, we can look at field safety corrective actions, all of those things, and do comparisons. Now, historically, that's been very hard because that data has been really difficult to get, but we'll get to all of that in a minute.
Yeah.
Design control, absolutely, right? When you're looking at device design, you really want to make sure that your risk management file has all of the hazards and harms, that you're looking at the relative rates of occurrence of those kinds of things so that you can make sure the device design is appropriate and reduces risk to the patient as much as possible, right? It also helps you when you're doing active post-market monitoring, make sure that you're state of the art, right? And of course, that's a requirement in Europe. We talked a little bit about regulatory submissions. That's pretty straightforward, especially on the post-market side. You want to be able to contextualize the post-market data that you have by comparing that with other sources. But also you want to be able to look at the risk-benefit analysis, right? So if you're doing a pre-market submission, being able to say, okay, here's a quantitative risk-benefit analysis that we've done. And that's really helpful in your pre-market submissions as well, in a place that maybe people don't think of that post-market data very naturally. And then, of course, there's the regulatory reporting, right? We all have to file adverse event reports, vigilance reports globally, and being able to benchmark and see, kind of have transparency to those other industries and agencies and other products that people are reporting. That's really helpful to do benchmarking and things like that in this space.
Well, with all of these areas, right? Is there a common process or system to help us marry these all into one cohesive, loop or closed loop process, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's just a lot.
It is a lot. And so let's talk a little bit about kind of how that's done today, right? So as you say, we have a lot of data sources, right? Of course, companies have all their internal data, right? Complaints, MDRs, recalls, CAPAs, et cetera, right? Got all of this internal data that you want to be able to analyze, you want to be able to include, right? You want to be able to see all of that data. We also have this external data, right? And that's really what we're focused on at Redica, right? So this is global vigilance, recalls, field safety corrective actions, adverse events, and then of course, literature, regulatory requirements, standards. Those are other Redica products we're not going to talk about today. We're just going to focus on kind of the post-market data, which is that vigilance and recall FSCA data. So lots of different places that this data is coming in. This should be analyzed for our records and for our distribution really throughout our company.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about process, right, let's talk about the ideal first. And so I think we'll go through this, and people on the call, right, when I was doing this in industry, it was like, oh, the ideal post-market surveillance process, right? So starting out, you would have your plan, you'd have predefined objectives, right? You'd be able to identify all of those data sets and define your inclusion-exclusion criteria. And then the data would magically come to you, right? It'd be clean, it'd be perfect, you'd be able to analyze it. Then you'd be able to put it into your reports, right? Wherever those regulatory records would be, whether that's like risk management files or post-market reports or whatever that might be, management review, you'd propagate it to all of those regulatory records. And then in an ideal world, it's actually driving actions, right? So if you see something like a new issue in your product space, you'd go in and be able to do something like say, hey, do we need a CAPA? Do we need a design change, right? Do we have to do any vigilance reporting for this for our own issues? What impact does this have on lots of different spaces for your product, right? So ideally, that post-market data is actually driving action within your company, within your QMS, and within your RIM system. So great, you drive all that action with your data, that's wonderful. And then you set up a continuous review process, right? And so that would be the monitoring of these events and trends over time. So you can get really clear trends, you can see where you have issues, where maybe the industry has issues, and you could establish things like action and alert limits where you could say, hey, when does this trigger the need for, additional actions or implementations? And that would just kind of keep going. So in the ideal world, it always feels very easy, right? Where it's like, oh yeah, this is our process and we can use all this data and it's perfect.
Well, that leads me to this question. So data is obviously all over this page. So where do we get the data today?
Yeah.
And are there any common complications we run into with gathering or analyzing and reporting or continuous review of this data, right? Everything that flows within this process. How do we do that, right? How do we get the data, number one, and what's the challenge today?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we move from kind of like this ideal space to what is reality, I think a lot of what we talk about here will resonate with, folks that are listening in, right? Where we're saying, okay, even just starting with locating this data can be a real challenge, right? So if we're saying, okay, what data sources can I go out and get? What are available to me? Those are not actually easily accessible The FDA does a great job of making data accessible on their website, but it's split in multiple different places, right? So actually identifying, locating, okay, here's the right data sources and here's what we're going to do with them, that can be a challenge.
Yeah.
Ingesting that data, right? So actually getting that data out of the records, out of the different databases. They come in different formats. You've got limited returns. And I know when I talk about that, everybody's thinking of the MOD database, right? So you only get 500 results in a search. That could be a week's worth of data for some products, right? And you can't pull a trend from a week. So those are the kinds of things that like make this just a very challenging space. So let's say, okay, we've located the data, we've ingested it, then we have to clean and structure it. And as we all know, all of this post-market data, this is entered by folks in different companies, folks in different countries, lots of variation in how this is entered. And so what we get is very messy data, right? There's not a lot of structure, there's lots of errors, there's not a lot of standardization or entity resolution, right? So cleaning and structuring is actually a key step that is very difficult for these data sources. So then after that, now we have to analyze it, right? And so the regulatory professional who maybe does or doesn't have a data science background is looking at all this data and trying to make heads and tails of it, right? What constitutes a trend? What should be included? What's the proper timeframes, right? All of these things are huge challenges for us as regulatory professionals when we're trying to analyze this. So let's say we make it all the way around this loop and now we're like, okay, this is great. We're going to report it. By the time usually you get to this stage, that data is very stale, right? It's taken multiple weeks or months sometimes. We've talked to different companies that say it takes months to get these reports through. They're a quarter or so old. That data is out of date, right? And so really then when we think about impacts within the company, it's less impactful because it's not timely, right? So you're not able to take as early an action. You're not able to head off risk as effectively as you could if you have fresh data that's really kind of propagating through the system, in a way that's timely.
Yeah, and so a couple call outs here, right? Like, so number one, again, finding the data, we'll come back to that, but cleaning and structuralizing it so that you can actually perform proper analysis. I mean, I've seen these data sets before. I don't know how anybody does that to any degree of statistically accurate analysis. I mean, running your own pivots, being able to structure the data to be able to run the appropriate pivots that you need to. And then there is missing pieces of data. As to your point, you have to compile different data sources, then put them together to get the appropriate pieces in to then create the pivot tables you want to see, right? So can we take one example of like how we access the data? Maybe say like, I don't know, the adverse event data from the MOD data set to help with post-market surveillance. So how do we get it and what can we do with it? Can you just walk us through that? Like, I think
absolutely. And I think too, again, when people think about MOD data, most regulatory professionals, mine included before Redica, is like, you would just kind of say, okay, how many hours am I going to spend on this, right? Like if I actually have to pull real data, how many hours am I going to need to invest in getting this data and actually getting something useful out of it? And as we all know, and again, kudos to the FDA for making this data available, right? So we have the MOD database here, and it's great for doing kind of pinpoint investigations, right? So kind of looking up in particular a particular event. But if you've got products like, let's look at like a particular glucose monitor, right? I have Dexcom in here and we just hit search. And this will take a minute, right? Because when we look at the MOD data, it's literally millions and millions and millions of events, right? It is a lot of data. And that's why the FDA has to limit the return records to 500, right? Like it's just, that's their limitation there.
Yeah.
But this is very narrow, right? So we were looking at the last month, 500 is all we're going to get. It greatly exceeds. So then you have to play around with that time frame to say, okay, now let's get a return less than 500, and then we'll try to extend our window, right?
Yeah, so you almost have to be like an expert at the FDA database itself and how to manipulate that.
Yeah, and you have to go in and get that. Now, there's two ways to view the data now that FDA allows you to do, right? Which is great. They allow you to export it to Excel or go right into, this particular event. And we can go into that event and we can look through, all of this data. And this is what I mean by kind of like pinpoint searching, right? So if you're just kind of like, oh, ad hoc, I kind of need to see what it looks like for this type of product or this product, you can go in and do that. Now, I took the liberty of downloading this one from Excel. And here's some of the interesting things about it, or some of the challenging things about it, right? So now you've got it in Excel format. We have, I think, about 12 fields that get returned. That's less than half the fields that FDA actually makes available, right? So you're actually not getting the full data when you're doing this Excel file. You know, what it does do is you can look at some things by product code and event type and things like that. But again, this data is as entered. So when we think about things like entity resolution and structuring and all of those kinds of things, you know, it's just not there, right? And that's—
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, so like if we're talking about something like, let's say I'm searching for Dexcom glucose monitors, but somebody spells it wrong, right? Or they put a space in, Dex space com. That result, it's not going to show up, right? Like if you're not spelling it correctly in your search, that's actually not going to be in your data set. And as we know, because again, these are form fills, right? There's a lot of error there. There's
And the
also
FDA is not doing entity resolution themselves, right?
not
I
their
mean,
job. Yeah.
and there's, I'm not saying anything bad about the FDA, but their job is not data. Their job is patient safety, right? So
Absolutely, absolutely. And they're doing such a service, right, by making these records
yes.
available. It's just kind of one of those things of like, great, now we have this data. And I've been searching the MOD database for a long time, right? Like back doing risk management files, what we would do is we'd download this and we'd read all the event text, right? So like we'd be reading through this event text and saying, okay, what's applicable to my risk management file, what's not, right? Making those evaluations. But there weren't a lot of tools to be able to say, hey, I actually want to hone in on this smaller pile of data, right? I want to filter for certain product types, product codes. I want to make sure that, you know, I don't have issues if I'm searching for a company name that I'm not getting records just because the company name was entered a little bit differently or something like that. So yeah, there's just a lot of challenges with this data, which I think, you know, everybody's experienced when we've used this database.
Right.
So let's get into kind of, we've gone over some of the challenges.
I just want to touch on that. Like, so again, with the challenges that we're up against in industry and what's available today, one of the biggest is actually getting clean, structured data. And because that's where all of your post-market surveillance capabilities start. And correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially being able to access that data in a way that allows you to, you know, run the specific reports or analyses that you need. So again, just wanted to highlight that, right? It's just very, very difficult for everybody to do today.
Yeah, it is. And you know, we looked at just the MOD database, but when we think about post-market data in general, you know, the MOD database is not enough, right? Like what we really want to do is we want to be monitoring globally, right? We want to monitor in all the spaces that our products are marketed. We want to look at vigilance reports, and we want to look at recalls. We want to look at other technologies that are similar to ours, right? If you've got a product that has a battery or a hermetic seal or a type of material that's novel, right? Those are the kinds of things that looking that up today is really not possible in the databases, right? But when you have a database that's clean, that's structured, that is indexed, you can do things like look for specific problems, specific technology types. And that really is a space of a lot of richness, right? When we think about like reducing potential risk.
Now, let me ask you, before you continue on here, Allison, real quick, like how much data do you actually need? Because I think that's like, again, going back to the example with the MOD data set and what you download 500 rows at a time, like what is a good subset of data?
Yeah, well, it depends on your objective, right? Like it depends on exactly what records are you filing, but really you want to be able to see the trends, right? So you want to look over a historical period of time, right? And it depends on the product of kind of like, is it a new product? Is it older, right? Like you want to basically be able to look at a history and be able to see, is there an evolution of the types of issues these products are, you know, having? When we look at the quality space, we want to see the trends of an organization or a site in terms of product quality, right? Are your recalls trending up or going down? Is it taking longer or shorter to close these? And not just for benchmarking, right? But for trends overall, right? Is FDA saying, hey, more mandatory recalls, right? Is that something that's new? So all of this context, you know, there's a kind of an advent of the utilization of data, right? Like there's an explosion of data, and more is more can be better, but only when you have the right tools to use it, right? When you can actually pull information out of it, right? So you want that data, again, to be working for you, not to be spending all of your time kind of hunting and pecking and trying to find the right records and the right things.
Which, to your point earlier, then it's eventually stale, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. And so that's why, I mean, really, when we think about Redica, right? Redica is a data company. This is what we've done for a long time in the space of inspection, enforcement, regulatory intelligence. And so just applying that framework of data science to the post-market data, obviously very natural kind of space to go into next. And we'll talk about some of the other things that we have kind of cooking as well. But what we do is kind of follow this circle, right? So we go out and we acquire the data, and this is global, right? So we're looking at Excel files from different regulators' websites. We're looking at Freedom of Information Act requests. We're looking at all sorts of different types of data that we can go out and get globally and pull in and analyze, right? What's actually going to be of use to our customers. So we're looking at these global databases. And again, today we're talking about that post-market. So that's really recalls, field safety, corrective actions, and vigilance and adverse events.
So with that data set, which agencies are we looking at today? Like what does Redica have access to today?
Yeah, so today we have FDA, we have Health Canada, we have TGA, we have Anvisa, and we have PMDA.
Great.
And we're adding to that, right? So we have a pipeline of going out and continuing to ingest the world's data to bring additional richness to kind of our risk models and all of these kinds of predictive analytics that we're doing around this. So absolutely, I think, you know, it's definitely not ending with those. And so we've got this great space. And what you oftentimes hear from the regulators is when you're looking at things like measuring and monitoring and looking at quality, they will ask, what areas are you monitoring, right? So it's really not sufficient anymore to say, oh, I look at FDA and I pull, you know, from FDA's dashboard, or I'm looking at mod events. Really, they're expecting a global approach. And so that's what really we want to facilitate for our customers.
Great.
So as you can imagine, with more data sets is more unstructured data. And so that's that next piece of saying, okay, how are we going to build this up, right? What are we going to do in terms of normalization and enrichment, right? And it starts with some cleaning, standardization, entity resolution, all of those things happen. And then we have kind of intelligence or enrichment that we layer on top of that, right? And those are things like linkages. So linking products to sites, linking inspection and enforcement to sites, right? All of these different kinds of linkages that we're able to build through the data. And then we have a layer of labeling that we put on top of it as well. So I mentioned previously some of the searches you could do potentially like over the entire data set. We make some of those easy, right? So for example, we have a label that says this product has artificial intelligence in it, right? So if you want to look at all the adverse events in the space of artificial intelligence, we could do that, right? You just click that filter button and it's there for you. And so these labels, you know, we continue to develop these, and those can become very important in terms of the analysis. So we do all of that normalization, enrichment, labeling, linking, and then we put intelligence on top of it, right? And so these are things like our risk models, our scoring. We have AI ML projects that are kind of in the works as well. And that's kind of layering on this piece of analytics for risk and things like that. Red flags, right? Should we be concerned? We see an uptick in adverse events. Is it a big uptick? Is it not, right? Those are the kinds of things that we'll layer on top, and we just put right there in the dashboards as well.
Yep.
And then finally, we have our analytics and reporting, right? And that's kind of the delivery method of how is this data accessible, right? We have reports. Those are dashboards in the system. We've got event profiles, so you can really see in one place all of your data. And one, I think, important thing to note, especially in this place of post-market, is you've got post-market data, you have multiple different stakeholders in the organization that want to use this data and they want to access it, right? But they're looking at it differently. So the analysis that a quality professional preparing for management review is going to do, that's going to differ than the engineer pulling data for a risk management file, right? We have dashboards for both. So we have these kind of subject matter based dashboards so that you can have the analytics that you need really to complete the work that you need to do.
Well, that's a perfect segue. So what would be like, let's talk through some of these use cases, and then maybe jump into the platform. How about that?
Yeah, I love it. Yep. So just a screenshot here. We'll go into the platform in just a second of our dashboards. And like I said, we've got Postmarket Intelligence. We have a whole lot of dashboards within that and more coming so that you can have exactly what you need, right? And so, yeah, let's kind of get into these use cases.
Well, before you go into the platform,
yeah,
let me know so I can do the drum roll, or John can do the drum roll, right? So, the big unveiling.
Absolutely, yeah. So let's start out with, and again, there's so many different use cases. We've kind of got 4 that we wanted to talk through at a really high level. And, we don't have all the time in the world. We could talk for a long time about any one of these, but we'll just get an introduction to our approach here. But use case 1 is kind of this quality monitoring and benchmarking. So this is typically what quality, sometimes regulatory professional is doing in the quality unit. They're preparing for management review. They're doing competitive analysis. They're looking at, their own quality versus competitors in the space. They're doing some on the product level as well, but a lot of it's really high. It's at the organizational level. Another thing that they're typically doing is looking for trends. So again, like high level trends, like are the amount of recalls going up, right? Are they going up in a certain space that's our space that we need to be concerned about, right? Those are the kinds of things they're trying to keep their finger on the pulse of. What is this data trying to tell us, and how can we get ahead of any organizational risk? There's also the space of due diligence, right? So if you're looking at acquiring companies, you want to take a look at lots of different data sets, and this is certainly one that you would want to look at.
So this really goes into that thing that we always talk about here, which is historically industry has been very reactive because of the simple fact that, number 1, the data is hard to get. Number 2, it's really hard to analyze. And then number 3, by the time you do that, it's stale. So there's really not the ability to be proactive unless you have certain tools already set up, process built for these quality professionals to actually be able to be proactive in any sense of the matter, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, we talk to a lot of companies, and a lot of their objectives kind of, we've heard for many years, from reactive to proactive, right? And what companies are now realizing or kind of pursuing is saying, hey, we can get very early action if we use some of this data, right? So if we kind of try to know what's coming down the pike, and we can assess competitors, we can assess the space, that's really important. The challenge, of course, with that is the data can make it really hard, right? So if you have an organization that's very large and you compare your amount of recalls to another organization, well, of course, that's crazy, right? You might have different business units, you have different sizes, you have different products. But if you're able to condense that, and we provide the filters to do that, to say, actually, we're going to pair our organization to another organization, and we're going to do that along certain products or product lines or medical specialties, we can do that. And then that data is there. And in that way, you actually can pull useful insights from the data, right? So yeah, it's very exciting. Yeah, should we show some dashboards?
All right, cool. Drum roll.
Yeah. Okay. So here's one that I pulled up. It's actually the one that's on my slide. And this is an organizational benchmarking of mod events, right? So this is MDR reports. This is mod events. And what we did is we searched for hip implants and said, okay, let's do this at the regulation number. If you wanted to, you could do it at lots of different levels, right? You could do it at the product code level if you just wanted to look at one thing. Again, the filters on the left, this is this space of saying, we have a lot of filters, right? You can get to the data that you need, and we make it very easy. So that's what's exciting to me. So we've got hip implant manufacturers pulled up here, and we're just doing some organizational benchmarking. We have other dashboards that will do product benchmarking. So you can look at what are the types of problems these products are having, right? We've got site benchmarking. We've got trend dashboards. We've got all sorts of different ones. But this one is saying, okay, let's look at these different organizations. Let's see the number of events that are filed for this particular product type, these particular regulation numbers. And you can see we've got trend lines, and we slice it and dice the data in lots of different ways, right? So I won't get into all of this because we could spend hours on like each dashboard, and I would be happy to if anyone is interested, because this is so fun for me. But But yeah, we can look at all of this data, and always, we want to have transparency, right? So when you see our dashboards, you'll see at the bottom of the dashboard, there is a table to say, here's what's feeding all of these visualizations, right? Here's what's feeding this data. So you can really check.
Can you go back up real quick? Because like I want to call something out, going back to our earlier conversation about challenges in the marketplace today, right? We've compiled the last 12 months of data for just hip prosthesis manufacturers, and that's 8,807 mod events. Like if you could only pull 500 rows at one time of data from the mod database, I'm like, this saves so many hours of time. And I'm not just saying this because I work at Redica and I'm biased, right? I've actually shown this and previewed this with other MedTech companies and quality professionals at these MedTech companies. And the smile on their face, and it's not just because it's really pretty and it looks great, but it's because the thought process is, you just saved me hours of time. Hours, literal hours of time. And I couldn't even get to this specificity around organization name and the specific just number of events per organization name, not let alone all of the other ways to slice and dice this data. So I think that's just, it's massive, massive improvement to what's available in industry today and for our quality professionals that we work with.
Yeah, and to me, I mean, this is what actually liberates the quality and regulatory professionals to be able to do their job, right? Because what their job is should not be data science, right? It's not, okay, can I get all these events? Do I need to think about structuring and cleaning and all of that stuff? No, they need to be worried and concerned with product quality, right? So they need to be able to look at these and say, oh, here's a trend. We need to head off this issue. I see there's a spike here, right? Those are the kinds of things that, you know, we really want to be spending our time on and impacting product quality, safety, and effectiveness. So yeah, absolutely.
What can you highlight on this page that's like, okay, cool, this is the so what?
Yeah, so there's a couple of different things, right? So obviously when we think about like one of the biggest things that improves ease of use is like, we can put a whole lot of data in here, right? When we're talking about millions of events, that's really just huge. The other thing is really all of these filters. Now you'll see on our different dashboards, we have different filter types to help people do their jobs more effectively, right? But let's say, for example, like the medical specialty filter, if we said, listen, this one is filtered particularly for hip implants, but if we said, we want to compare our company's cardiac division against our competitive company's cardiac division and see what are the events that they're having, what are the events that we're having, you can do that, right? You just filter by org, filter by medical specialty, and there you have it. So we really do make that data really accessible. And then just a couple like great features, because again, I was kind of doing these reports just a few years back. All of this is downloadable, right? So any tile that you have, you can pull that. You can save these dashboards. So if you have something that instead of just searching for, you actually want to monitor, you want to save that and check in on it every week, you can save that particular dashboard and that will just be available to you. You can export the full report. So really what we wanted to like do is say, okay, how do we help the regulatory and quality professionals, again, save time, be more effective, all of those things.
Great. All right, so that's use case one.
That's use case one, and that's only half of use case one. I'm going to show you one more dashboard really quick for use case one.
Okay, keep going.
That was adverse events, and so I just want to show you really quick recalls. And
oh yeah, recalls, yeah, of course.
Yeah, I want to show you this one just because here we've got some of that Redica intelligence and labeling embedded and filterable here, which is great, right? So if we look at our product labels, this one's filtered for AI products. So this is recalls across different product types, across different organizations, across different trade names, and they all include artificial intelligence. Well, right off the bat, right, if you're working in anything TPLC, you're thinking, this is amazing for my hazard and harm identification for risk management, right? Can I see any clear trends in what's happening with products that include AI? This is great. We do also have linkages, right? So when we're looking at linking mod events to recall events, we have that, we trend that. No surprise on this chart when we're looking at AI, radiology is like the one that's outstanding in this case, right? That's what we would expect. But these are all things that as we go through, again, those product labels really help us do our job better and become more informative, to our other stakeholders within the companies.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that the product code piece, to me, when I started understanding the limitations in industry today, like I've talked to some people, very large companies, right? And the way they were historically doing this was looking at just who are the other top companies out there, and we just want to compare ourselves against them. And I'm like, but they don't even have the same products as you.
Yeah.
So, when we started talking about that, it was like, well, this is how we've always done it. And so we haven't had an easy way to just say, hey, because we only do these products, we only want to see the people that do these products,
Yeah.
and then compare ourselves and understand what are the trends against that specific product code. I find that it's just very enlightening, the ability to be able to filter and sort the data to get very specific at what matters to you as an organization or as a product specifically, etc. So,
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we used to kind of be at that very high resolution, right? Where we'd say, are recalls up or down? Are people
Right.
the entire industry, right? And it's like, okay,
Yeah.
what is that to us? But hey, there's a whole bunch of recalls in your product space due to a very specific issue.
Right.
You want to know, right? And that's
Yeah.
that part too of let's know what the regulators know, right? Let's try to make their job easier because, of course, if you have somebody show up on your doorstep for a for-cause inspection because there's problems in your product space, you
Yeah.
want to advance what those issues are and make sure that like you've done your part to kind of say, oh, we don't have those problems or here's what we're doing, right? So
Or you're just even aware, right, Allison? So it's like, hey, we saw those product specific recalls uptick, by 200% over the last quarter. We were expecting you to come, and here's what we've prepared for you. I mean, just the power of that with a regulator.
yeah,
I mean,
it's huge.
I've talked to lots of regulators. We talked to one a couple of weeks ago, and even he was like, "That's like icing on the cake for a regulator when we show up. It's just like we know you are on top of it right away, and it makes that inspection that much easier."
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And so that's kind of the case for quality trending. Oops, I've gone back and forth here. Quality monitoring and trending, right? Really important, really hard to do up until now. So a lot of potential there. The second piece I think we wanted to talk about is the post-market regulatory records, right? Those, of course, are these records that are going into regulatory agencies or into your QMS, PSUR, CER, PMSR, all of these post-market reports that you're doing at different levels for your different risks of device and different intervals, right? One of the things that we traditionally do here is obviously we put all of our internal data in, and then we say, okay, here's all of our internal data. Here's our complaints, here's our MDRs, here's our recalls, here's a whole bunch of other data, right? And then, so what, right? What
Yes.
does it mean? And so being able to, in a quantitative way, say, hey, we've got these events, and there are no new types of questions of safety or effectiveness, right? These are the typical kind of events that unfortunately you see in this product space or whatever that might be, or, hopefully we're much lower in rates of these events, right? That contextualization is incredibly important. And that's, again, been something that has been historically very difficult to do, is to say, to actually pull that data, to put it in the reports, to have it be fresh, and to provide that contextualization. So absolutely. And then of course, in this space too, when we're looking at kind of like, what can your data do for you? Obviously you need to do those regulatory records, right? Like that's just what you have to do, but really you want to monitor that product space, right? So, if you're a quality engineer and it's your product line, or you're a site head and it's your product line, you want to know what issues these products are having. And so being able to kind of go from that discrete reporting to continuous monitoring, it's a huge switch for people, and I think a great step for product quality and safety. And I can pull up one of these dashboards. So this is a product benchmarking dashboard. I've filtered this for intravascular administration sets because this was kind of interesting to me, right? It's like, okay, here's something going on, right? Like that's something, if you're monitoring and you're taking along from October to November to December and all is good, and then all of a sudden you say, what happened in May, right? That's something that you want to look into. You can double click into that and say, okay, who's filing these reports? What are happening? What's the issue, right? And we try to make some of these like red, yellow, green things really easy to jump out at you. So these are just interesting spaces, right? To say, okay, what are our biggest issue products? What do we need to monitor in this space, and what's going wrong with these devices potentially, right? That we're seeing such a jump. And so we can do things like deep dive into what are the exact device problems that are happening. So like, are they breaking? Are they leaking, right? Is there a material issue?
Yeah, it seems like especially with this one specifically, Allison, there's a major increase. It was almost 200%, right? And maybe there's just a new competitor on the scene that's reporting things. I don't know. You tell me, but like,
yeah. And that's the great thing about like being able to get this data as a regulatory professional, right? So you have that space because you're not spending all your time collecting this data. You can actually say, okay, let's look into this. It could be nothing, right? Maybe FDA changed a product code, or again, there's a new product that came in this space that is, having particular problems that your product doesn't, right? But those are the kinds of, what we think of as red flags to say, hey, you probably want to take a look at this, right? You probably want to be aware of this. Right. And so really providing that impetus to say, okay, let's do a little bit deeper dive into what's going on here. One thing I do want to point out is we do have this distribution, this geography of where are these events coming from. And so that's really cool, right? Because let's say you have a usability issue in a particular geography, that might pop out at you to say, wow, we've got limited distribution, in Spain, but all of our problems are coming from Spain. What's going on there? Is there an off-label use? Is there an issue, right? And so you can kind of see these things come to light, which I find just really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's one of our product benchmarking dashboards. Oh, and one thing I did want to mention too, because we talked a little bit about like this risk space and the red flags. We do have those dashboards as well, which are very exciting in terms of like monitoring and looking at the increases and decreases of adverse events. So those are fantastic as well, just for that continuous monitoring piece.
Yeah.
So that's a little bit of use case two. We know we're coming up on time, so we're going to just kind of speed through these last couple, right? Use case three, total product lifecycle, right? Yeah. So this is kind of that design control. You have a new product you're designing, you're getting it to market for the first time, change control, you've got to change to a product, or just maintenance over the product lifecycle. And of course, primarily we're focused on risk management, right? So your risk management file, your risk management updates, hazard and harm identification, all of those kinds of things. This data is great for that. And again, I used to be the one hunting and pecking through the mod database, right? To say, have I captured all of the event types that are common for this product area, right? Would have been great instead of spending a week on that to be able to just see it in a dashboard. We have a couple of different dashboards that we use for this, but I'm going to share with you our design risk dashboard that I already have up. And again, this is looking specifically at issues the device is having, right? So instead of comparing devices, this is saying, okay, let's pick a particular device or device type and really unpack what kind of problems are they having? Are they having device problems? Is it mainly malfunctions? Is it a lot of patient problems? And what's going on in those cases? So as we kind of go down that dashboard, we get deeper and deeper into kind of like, what are these exact problems that we're having? And we're able to see kind of all of these, device issues. So here we've got a stapler, no surprises here. Misfiring, failure to form staples, failure to fire, right? All of those things are easy to see. Now, this is one of the things I think is really interesting, because what we want to do then is also not just look at those issues, but say, how are they changing over time? So if we're comparing last year to this year, what's the delta? Are we seeing an increase? Is there a problem type that's decreasing, right? We want to monitor that and take a look at that. And so we have kind of percent changes and rankings and things like that.
What do you do with that, Allison? What do you do with that?
Yeah, so those are the kinds of things where there's a couple of things. One, again, when we're just looking at these device problems, you're actually comparing in your risk management file and saying, have I captured all the potential hazards and harms, right? Am I comprehensive in my risk management file? And of course, that risk management file is tied directly to your design control process, where let's say you have a problem where you're saying, gosh, failure to fire staples, this is huge. Is our mechanism to fire state of the art? What could go wrong with that, right? Those are the
Okay.
kinds of things where we're talking about real world impact on products and increasing safety and decreasing risk for the patient and for the company. So yeah, so this is great, right? And you can get really quantitative about it, right? You can see exactly where these events are being filed, what these events entail, right? Those are really interesting. And there's a lot of detail that we get from this. And obviously you can see that here. You can also look at other devices that are having these problems, right? So you can kind of benchmark and say, okay, from the commercially available products, we've designed features that are similar to ones that are having problems, right? And so you could potentially head that off in your own process. Another thing when you're looking at like risk, from my regulatory background, as you're filing a pre-market submission, definitely looking at this dashboard to say, okay, when FDA gets my 510K or my PMA, what is their mindset when they're thinking about my risk benefit analysis, right? And so that's data that you actually want to include. So again, this kind of goes all across the board in terms of the regulatory records that it hits.
Love that.
Yeah. And then last one, I know we're wrapping up, but I'll just mention it really quickly, is kind of this space of literature and clinical evaluation. So looking at real world evidence, and we know that the MOD and recall databases are not real world evidence in the same sense that something like an EMR is, obviously, but this is good evidence to take into account as you're doing things like clinical trial design. And more companies are kind of taking advantage of this data as they're able to find it more easily and writing white papers, doing investigations, right? Looking at things like, what should we be looking for in the literature around this space, right? What's interesting? So this, I think, is a really exciting and emergent space of kind of feeding more and more of these data sources into things like clinical trial planning, looking at what are anticipated adverse events in this space, right? As well as kind of literature and white papers. So it's a really interesting space, lots of different applications for it. And this is just kind of the fourth.
So, okay, so we really focused specifically on post-market surveillance, product quality, data sets, right? So I'm super excited about this. Again, I've had a few calls with some of our customers or potential customers out there are already showcasing this, and we're getting really amazing feedback. Thank you for showing this to everybody. I'd love for us to be able to walk anybody else who's listening to this webinar through the data, get feedback from them as well. But where are we going with this? I mean, are we done? This is it for MedTech? What? No, that's it. Yeah. There's no more data for us to go grab. Like, that's it. We're good. Yeah. Or where else are we going? Can you give us kind of an idea of what our roadmap might be as well to help MedTech customers specifically?
And I'm laughing because I am just super excited about this, right? Because this is the tip of the iceberg, right? We've got multiple agencies. We've got post-market data. We're going to continue to ingest the world's post-market data, get better and better analysis. There's a couple spaces that I want to mention. One, just in terms of the post-market data, again, we didn't share these, but happy to share with anyone who's interested some of our predictive modeling around these things, right? We also have specialty analysis for things like clinical risk, and those are done on a custom level. So we've got really, really exciting ways that we're actually deepening this data analysis and the insights that you can get from it. But then, of course, we've got a whole other product space that we're getting into, right? So Redica, again, historically, we've been known for inspection intelligence, our vendor intelligence, that's inspection and enforcement, our regulatory intelligence, that's along the lines of monitoring the regulatory authorities and all other sources for regulations, guidance, et cetera. Post-market, we talked a little bit about today. And then we're kind of going into the rest of the TPLC, right? So we actually have, for regulatory strategy, some pre-market available in a prototype space. We're excited to share that with people. That's coming along great. And that's looking at things like supporting regulatory submissions, right? If you've got a new regulatory, a new product or a changed product and doing your regulatory submission, what's your global strategy, right? And Redica is really uniquely positioned for that because, again, we have all of these different data sets in addition to the pre-market data set, which we didn't talk about today. And then finally, clinical, right? So ideally, we want to serve all of these different verticals. And we've got the clinical space, that's things like clinical trial planning, literature, so you can do full CERs, those kinds of things. And so we're really excited for those two horizons as well.
Yeah, very excited about that. I kind of like teed that up. I already knew the answer, right?
but excited to share. Yeah.
It is,
Yeah.
it is, it is. I'm
That's
glad we were
great.
able to. So John, I don't know if we don't have a lot of time to take any questions, but
We
you
don't.
tell me.
No, we're pretty much up on time. I want to say thank you to you both, Ryan and Allison. This is indeed really exciting. I want to say to those listening, if you would like a demo customized to not only your company, but your specific business unit, we would be more than happy to do that for you. Just go to redica.com. You can email this email address shown on the screen, info@redica.com, and we would be happy to discuss a custom demo with you. If you're not quite ready for a custom demo and you just want to keep in touch, we do have a great e-newsletter that goes out just twice a month so we don't clutter your inbox. And if you're not, that is called The Signal. And if you're not already subscribed to The Signal, we would be happy to subscribe you. You can just send a note to blog@redica.com and we will get you subscribed. So with that, again, thank you, Allison and Ryan, and thank you to everyone who has joined us today. And we will be in touch.
Thanks.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.